to the Plutus Foundation webinar series. Today we're talking about systemic issues and your money, and one systemic issue in particular is going to be racism and just how the system has been set up and is creating a situation that even today is has an effect on people's money all around the country and all around the world. So I am super pleased to have with us today Alanna Anthony. Alanna from financialdemics.com, and you can find Alanna at financialdemics. And Stephen M. Hughes. Stephen is the founder of No Money Inc., as well as the Bankroll Summit, and you can find him on Twitter at No Money Steve. So thank you both for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great thing that this is a great topic to talk about. I think it has been very informative for me over the past month or so to learn more about issues that I may not have experienced growing up because of where I was born, who I am, and the situation that I was born into. My situation is going to be very different, especially when we're dealing with money, than other people's situation. And I'm hoping through what we're doing at the Plutus Foundation is to be able to bring these ideas forward and share them with more people, so more people can have a better understanding of the systemic issues that prevent people from succeeding with their finances. And this is such an important topic for the community that we have, because we have so many financial writers and speakers and podcasters who talk about how to improve their finances. But some of the advice that is out there can be taken in and applied by some people and not always by others due to systemic issues. So I really want to get to the bottom of this as much as we can today. I think it's going to be a great discussion. So I think maybe a good way to start off is to take us back 400 years. And even though we're talking a little bit about history today, it's important to remember that how everything that has happened in the past in this country has an existing effect even to this day. So, Stephen, why don't you lead us off and take us back a few hundred years and tell us exactly what the American experience was like for people who were coming to this country?
Well, I think it depends on how you came to this country, whether it was by opportunity, saying like, oh, this is something that I'm going to explore and I'll be able to build wealth, or if you were sent here like from Europe as a criminal, and you ended up staying here and settling here and participating in owning slaves and the enslavement of Black people. But I think that if we're talking about the people that have been brought here against their will, we're thinking about the experience of the enslaved people from not only 1619, but even up through the Emancipation Proclamation, like 1863. And I know that you, Alanna, and I were talking a little bit before we started, but I think that there's a pretty hardcore myth, and the three of us are in the personal finance community, so we know that you don't learn everything that you're supposed to learn, like to be a well-functioning adult in like K through 12. Because most of us didn't talk about money like in elementary school and middle school and high school. And at the same time, I think that when we start talking about race or money or even building wealth, the racial wealth gap, people think that, well, whatever I learned in school was just, that's what it was. That was a story. And I think it in general was literally a story, because when you're thinking about, even going from 1619 to 1863 and the Emancipation Proclamation, enslaved people weren't really free. Like, freedom wasn't something that existed in reality, because the opportunity to build wealth or life, liberty, and the pursuit of property or happiness, depending on what Constitution you're reading, it wasn't a thing for everyone, especially people who came here against their free will. So I think that's the place that we could start, even because I know that this conversation will have a lot of historic tones to build the foundation so we can all understand and be on the same page, in the same book, with the same author. But just knowing that, a lot of people's history started when they started learning about American history in elementary school or in middle school or in high school. And that doesn't paint the real picture of what opportunity looked like for each person or each community that came to this land, or even the communities that were already here.
So for those of us whose only education in American history has come from those textbooks in elementary school and then going up through the school system, how do we learn more about the experience of people who weren't the subject of those textbooks?
Yeah, I think that it really starts with the want to learn more about like the actual history of this land, and not just kind of sitting in the being oblivious to saying like, oh, well, things are different now. Everyone can get a job now. Everyone can raise a family now. Everyone can buy a house now. It's still not an even playing field. And I think for anybody who, follows sports in general, if there's 100-yard dash and you're starting on the 40-yard line and I'm starting at the goal line, the race outcome would look very different. And so when we're thinking about history, if you want to start finding more information about how history really happened and unfolded, you can read books like The Color of Law by, I want to say his name is Richard Rothstein, or you could read books like The Color of Money with Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. And even those two foundational books, they are so many different decades of history that go back to enslaved people, and how those same practices and principles kind of play out in what a lot of people, hold up and say, this is excellent, which we call capitalism here in the United States. But those are two sources that I think are great places for people to start. And, I can throw podcasts and things like that out too. But I think if you want to get some foundational principles and understanding better, like, you can start there.
So why is it then that we have there's no slavery today, and civil rights civil rights have progressed. I have heard from people who strongly believe that everyone has the same opportunity today, and this is hundreds of years since 150 years since slavery. How is it that that people do still have an unequal or unfair start to this race that you're talking about?
Do you want me to continue, or Alanna, you want to jump in here?
I can jump in.
Okay.
Okay. So I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that people feel like, well, I work with somebody who is Black, so you have the same opportunities. But the reality is, when we became free as slaves, a lot of our ancestors, I mean, I can truly say, like, my grandmother lived through the Jim Crow era. So I saw some of those effects on her, even like when I was a young adult. And I'm like, well, why do you do this? And it's because of the era in which she grew up. When we were let free as slaves, like, we weren't given the same opportunities. They made it seem like we had the same opportunities, but even though we were free, they didn't want us to get education. So if you look back, I can speak from my own family makeup. Like, my grandmother, she went to school until 8th grade. My grandfather, I found out because I was asking questions, he went to school until 2nd grade. And when you do some research, you can find out that a lot of the schools, like if the school wasn't burnt down, then you were trying to hide and pretend you're going to the store, but you're trying to take your kid to school, or teachers were ran off. And so the schools in the Black community just didn't exist. So that was another thing. So there was a struggle there. And then when you're looking at trying to get jobs and trying to get pay, like you're not getting paid the same as everyone else. And that's still, if you want to fast forward it, that's still the same today. Like the Black man makes 87 cents to every dollar a white man makes. And you may think, well, that's not that much. Well, it adds up when you add up every single dollar. And when you think about the cost of living and the things that we have to pay for, this has been going on for years. And so eventually it becomes an issue that continues to build. Between the whole, man, we can go so deep into this, between the whole thing with, and I'm gonna just bring this up with the whole, the chain gangs, the whole thing with that, because your husband goes to the store and stops to say, hey, to his friend, you're loitering. There was a rule that Black men couldn't loiter. So now we throwing him in the chain gang. So he working for y'all for free. So he's back to working for free. And now he's out of that woman's household, those children's household. So that means there's an issue with income in that household now, because now you've taken that income away from them because somebody stopped to speak to someone on the road, when you all could easily speak to someone on the road. It wasn't an issue, but for us, it was loitering. And so that becomes an issue that continues to build, and it starts to build a suppressive mindset. And I brought up my grandmother because my grandmother wouldn't even question a doctor. Every doctor until probably until I would say the last 10 years she had, for the most part, they were white. And if there was something that was off, she wouldn't question them. And I remember asking her, like, why you didn't ask? And she was like, oh, you don't ask. And that mindset is set from growing up during that Jim Crow era. You're not going to ask no questions. You're going to look. I used to tease her that she would be dressed up to go to the doctor. I'm like, why are you so dressed up to go to the doctor? But it's like, you dress up to go to the doctor because you want them to feel like, you know, you're worthy, like you know how to act and things like that. That's a mindset that is set from things that happened back then. And even with the things that have held us back, then you have the people who feel like they're never going to give us what we deserve, so they don't even aim to do better. And yeah, I'm gonna stop right there because I feel like I could go for a while. Steven, is there something you want to
I was gonna say, just so that people understand what you mentioned about the chain gang. So after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, when it was said that all enslaved people are free, there were laws put in place to say that, okay, well, if there's a crime that's committed, then you are back enslaved. And I know that Harlan, you had mentioned just a little while ago, we have freedom in this country now, and why aren't things different now? But if you think about even now in 2020, people who are arrested and sent to prison, they are going to be working, and they're going to be they're going to be giving slave labor in that same instance. And in a time where we can think about how Black and brown people are targeted, more than other communities as far as population and percentage for crimes, and why there's a disproportionate number versus population and the population in a prison or a jail for Black and brown people. It's the same thing when you're thinking about what's going on in 2020. And so you asked the question of why things haven't changed or why things haven't gotten ahead. I think that as you mentioned, the system of it all, it was created like this to make sure things stayed in place. I remember that somebody was asking me, what about Black banks? Black people have banks in their communities now. And, Black banks consistently dwindle over the years. There was a point where I think at the highest peak there were like 50 Black-owned banks. At this point, it's like 19, maybe 20. And even going back, like earlier this week, I think it was the 29th on Monday, in, I want to say it was 1874, 1875. A lot of people know the story of Frederick Douglass, how he, was born in slavery and he worked to get himself out of slavery. But Frederick Douglass sat on the board for the Freedmen's Bank, and it ended up like being just totally ran through as far as like how people were managing money. And you didn't have any Black people on that board really before they asked Frederick Douglass to come on and restore community support and community trust. But there were just really crazy investments into all types of companies that people who were on the bank board served on. And so you think about how the control of capital happens, and if that same thing is going on today. And I think if we talk about like boards in general, whether it's a bank board or your favorite tech company's board or your favorite like grocery stores board, right? How many of those people are Black or people of color? And if they are Black or people of color, like what percentage of the board is made up of these diverse people? I think those are questions that we can ask just to see, well, how much has changed at this point? Because I think oftentimes we hear the term diversity and inclusion, and in 2020, it's become a checkbox. I think we can all see that because of how many companies are coming out and kind of marketing Black Lives Matter, but there aren't things that are changing in general for the specific changes that Black people and people of color are asking for, like in regards to like police violence against the community. There's been a slew of different things that have happened. Like Netflix has come out with media and they're telling you these things you should watch, and people are on the front lines. I think that I saw like a sandwich company change their BLT to BLM. Like just stupid things, right? And none of these things are things that Black people or people of color ask for. It's literally marketing now and cranking up the dollar machine now to say, hey, we support you, we're on your side. And I think that is something that has been consistent like since 1863, to say like, hey, we support you, we're on your side, we want you to be free, we want you to be able to build wealth, we want you to be able to do what you want to do and really build wealth for your family. But there's always an undertone of like this system that's not working for the betterment of Black people or people of color.
Right. We're not on their executive management teams. We're not on their boards. And just to piggyback off of what Stephen said, he said exactly what I have been saying for like the last week. Like, I heard about how in Texas, the real estate commission, they're not going to call master bedrooms masters anymore, master bathroom. That is not what we asked for. We want you to stop killing us. We didn't ask you for that. and that's what these companies need to understand. Like, they need to understand that we really need your support in a different way. You changing verbiage up and things like that, that's not what we need. We need you to really stand up for us, put us up in positions in which we can really make a change at the company. Because diversity and inclusion, a lot of companies get that award like, oh, we're one of the most diverse companies, but nobody Black is sitting in your executive management team or in the C-suite whatsoever. So it's just because, yeah, you have people in your call centers and your processing teams and things like that. But if you really want to support us, then put us in the positions where we can make decisions.
So what would be the outcome of that, with more diversity in the executive level and on the board of directors for-profit, nonprofit companies across the country? What would be some of the direct results of that?
I think it'll change the way like some companies actually do their actual giving, because a lot of companies do giving and they typically will support organizations like mainstream organizations, but you should look at organizations that are smaller in Black communities, and not just Black communities. I'm sure there are some smaller organizations, other communities that need support, but they tend to favor those large, well-known organizations. I think it'll also help with showing other youth in the community that you can make it to this level. I think in our community, and Stephen, you can let me know if you agree, like a lot of times when you do find out somebody's at that level, it's very few of them who kind of go back and help build up other people to get to that level. And so that affects the way, you know, our mindset as far as like, can we do things? And sometimes it affects our mindset of whether or not we go back and look out for others. And that is something that we should do. I think it also would help with just the whole, just decision making as a whole, because a lot of the people who sit in the C-suite and sit on boards, they're not just on one board. A lot of times they're on other boards, and so that affects other companies. That'll also affect some of the mistakes we've seen from companies when it comes to insensitive advertising and things like that. I think it'll make people think a little bit more before they put things out, and then they're just like confused as to why we're upset.
No, I think that you're hitting the nail on the head there. And like in addition to that, I'll say, like, from a standpoint of discrimination, right? So we're thinking about when like terms of affirmative action first entered like the U.S. vocabulary, and how there was a lot of there was a lot of pushback to say like, oh, well, we don't want inferior people. Like, we don't want to have to hire inferior people for these jobs that we need, you know, people at the top level to do. And, you know, you're thinking about 2020, Black women are the most educated group of people in the country. And like, there have been studies, like several studies done, that say when there are women who are in leadership positions, there are more people who are coming to the table. One, because there are different perspectives that are being thought of and shared and shown. And so you're thinking about not only what that does for a household when equal pay is happening, but what that also does for the community, as Alanna had mentioned, because it's not just perspective or a feel-good moment to say like, oh, there's a Black person in the executive team. It's not just for the Black community. I think that because we have generally understood like what the benefits of diversity is, when it comes to, the benefits of diversity are for people across the board, not just for Black people, but for other people of color, for white people, for companies in general. When you have someone else with a different perspective who is at the top of their field, top of their craft, not saying like, oh, I'm not going to hire Alanna, I'm going to hire Sarah for this specific position. You're shooting yourself in the foot because of the expertise that Alanna has and what she can bring to the table. And I think that those are things that will change immediately. Like, you know, as you see more people, and I'm not here to, you know, put a cape on and say like, oh, we should have a bunch of Black people join a bunch of boards and executive teams right now. That would be great, but I'm definitely not holding my breath for that. I think that if we're looking for what evidence we can see of change and what that change looks like when someone gets to a leadership position, it's easy to see, like, there's been so many studies by colleges and universities on what diversity does, what true diversity does, not just like checking the box to say, hey, all right, we've got a Black woman, we've got an Asian man, let's keep rocking with this tech team. I think that really diving into different perspectives, talents, treasures that people have because of their diverse background and experiences is something that, you know, in general, the country misses, as discrimination, you know, the fire keeps turning up on discrimination.
Sure. Staying on the topic of discrimination, can we talk about redlining and how that is holding people back?
We can definitely talk
We
about
sure
that.
can.
All right then.
So I think that before we talk about redlining, right, I think that um, it's important to kind of give some context to the conversation of redlining. And when it comes to redlining, it's a very visual thing to hear and for me to explain, right? Because, like, say that you're in New York, post World War, right? You come home, there are all types of benefits that are being drawn up and written out, like GI bills and different VA loans that you can use to access to buy a house or to build wealth. Because at that time, wealth was said like, okay, if you have a place to stay, like for you and your family, you should be able to build wealth in that regard, right? And so, there were consistently neighborhoods that, one, would not allow Black people in the neighborhood, whether they fought in the war or not, right, on the front line. And two, there weren't any loans given to our veterans, like from the Black community, so that they could participate uh, in buying a house and kind of building wealth in the American dream. And then, so when it comes to redlining, if you're looking at a map, there were government officials and bank professionals who would draw a line around an area or a neighborhood and say like, hey, we cannot we cannot allow people of color, like Black people, to enter this community, because it wasn't just Black people. I think that that's something that may be
Yeah.
like may not been learned for a while, but it wasn't just Black people. It was people of all communities that were not white, right? In California, you had heavy discrimination against people of Asian descent. And in New York, I just remember this one story about this place called Levittown, where and I don't even know if this has changed, but there were no Black people allowed for decades, right? And I'm here in Columbia, South Carolina. If you kind of go down the street a little bit to Orangeburg, South Carolina, I remember meeting a man who he built his real estate development company like in New York. The only reason he moved down to South Carolina was because his son was going to college here. And he bought a house. Him and his wife bought a house, but he couldn't go to closing. He couldn't show his face. Like, he couldn't really register too much information for people to know who he was, because on the deed, it still said, do not sell to N-words. And this is 2020, so this is like 14 years ago.
What?
Yeah, this is not yeah. So I'm talking about like when it comes to redlining, it was like a deliberate and specific outlines and laws and regulations, and just factor after level of discrimination to say like, hey, we want to make sure that we don't give Black people and people of color like the opportunity to build wealth. Because even when we talk about like the Emancipation Proclamation, or you hear people talk about the 40 acres and a mule, and they joke around about that. Like, a lot of people joke around about it now, but there was a point where 40 acres were being given out to Black people as saying like, hey, we really effed this up. Like, we're trying to get right. Here's some land. And in less than 5 or 10 years, the government said, hey, we're not doing that anymore. We're not owning up to that. Like, forget that. You're not going to get any handouts from us. But land was literally given to white people, and even people who were immigrants of the country who may not have been treated the best when they first got here. They were sold on an idea of, well, at least you're better than Black people. At least you can live in this neighborhood with us. At least you can, do these different things that Black people can't do. So it's like discrimination all the way around, not just with the neighborhoods, but a lot of your wealth is built in your house. And when back when the neighborhoods were segregated, and they still are to a large degree these days, but back when neighborhoods were like more outright and loudly segregated, right? You had Black people who would move in there who may have gotten their wealth up to another level. And once there was a percentage, like once there were too many Black people that moved in the neighborhood, then the property values would start dropping. So then you would have white people who would say like, well, I don't want my property value to drop. I'm moving out of here. I'm leaving the neighborhood. And then the same exact property, it could be a three bedroom, 2-bathroom house in this same neighborhood, and a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house in 2 neighborhoods over. The value of this Black person's home would be 1/10 of the value of a white person's home. And so you think about, if you want to pull like a home equity line of credit on your house, and your house is being appraised at $250,000, and mine is being appraised at $25,000, and we're both trying to build a company, like that's what redlining does, or that's what redlining has done to the community, and what it continues to do in large part, because there aren't many things that are changing. Like, it's 2020, and I know Alanna mentioned before we jumped on here, like there's a lot of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps type mentality and conversations going on. And until we like reel back and go back and say like, hey, redlining was wrong, let's get these property values back up and make it equal, and make sure there's equity in each community, we're not going to be able to really fix things.
Yeah, and actually, so I want to hit on 2 things you said, Stephen, too. So I was reading this news article where they interviewed this man. He grew up in like the 1920s, 1930s. His family actually had like acres of land, horses, a carriage and buggy. They lived nicely. His mother would go into the city or into the town to buy stuff and come back. And so they had laws that were set up where if they claimed you owed money, they could take all your stuff. And he grew up in Mississippi, and this is what happened to his family. Like, they accused his father of owing $3,000 for something, and he was like, I don't owe $3,000. But if you fought those type of like accusations, you could be injured or killed. So he basically had to just shut up and let them take everything. They took everything that they actually owned. And so that's something that also affects the reason why, like even if we were given stuff back then, it was easily taken away from us, and we couldn't do anything about it. But also to get back to with the whole idea of redlining. So when it comes to redlining, thanks for giving that so vivid explanation. But also there were situations that happened, like even here, I live in Queens, New York. There's a very nice area of Queens that is Black owned, or it's a Black neighborhood, very stately houses. Love this area. And I found out that when Black people started being able to buy into this neighborhood, that Black people will come home and see a notice on their door saying, it didn't say Black people, but N-word, or moving into the neighborhood, your property values are going to drop, sell now. And so people were coming home to this, and like there was like a mass exodus, which also affects your home values, because you have homes that are just sitting out there and you're not really letting us buy. But then when we get into a neighborhood, you are leaving that neighborhood. And so these houses are sitting empty, which is going to decrease the value of the home. And then also, like even today, I don't really like, even though redlining is illegal, I do think that reverse redlining does exist. I think there's a lot of predatory lending in Black areas, especially when we look back at what happened in 2008 with the housing crisis. And so we had talked about this for a second, Harlan, but I can kind of talk from just my own perspective. So I bought a home in 2007, height of the market. I bought a short sale. And I aimed for a short sale, but what I didn't realize is that I was moving into a neighborhood where most of those people, it was a Black middle-class neighborhood, somewhere you want to live, and most of those people had predatory loans. So as the market fell out, I came into a house with $20,000 in equity, and within a year, I was underwater.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those people, I found out from just, talking to them and going to the neighborhood meetings, like they had those balloon payment loans, 0 down with the ARM. So it's adjustable rate mortgage where, you start out, you have like, I'm just making up numbers, a 2% mortgage. And then all of a sudden your mortgage is 8%. That's a lot of interest and your income didn't increase at the same rate. And so a lot of those people lost their homes. And so now I'm in a neighborhood where, there's some people there, it wasn't all of them, but we were probably at a good, I want to say 35% foreclosed. Like neighborhood was completely foreclosed. It took, I think my house finally flipped from being underwater, even though I never missed a payment, continued paying. It took to like fall of 2015. And the reason why I know that there's something going on still with Redlining is because there's a neighborhood a mile up the road, same type of houses, those houses flipped in value very quickly. Like, I won't say it's like, I'll say like within 5 years, they had already recovered. And I was still trying to recover to the fact that even when I moved here, I was underwater and had to rent because I was like, I don't want to come out of pocket thousands of dollars to sell this house. So I do feel like reverse redlining is still going on and it's still affecting the values in our neighborhoods. And even now, well, I know we're now in a recession. I wanted to give the air quotes, but it is the end of the quarter. So we're in a recession. And, but I know at one point before COVID, they were talking about doing the interest only loans again. And we know interest only loans are terrible. And from what I understand, or from the statistics I did back then, like it was mostly Black people who were taking on these loans because it would allow for them to get into a house and start to build wealth. That was their thought process, but they didn't understand the effects of what happens if I don't get enough money or make enough money in this many years to cover this mortgage payment or get refinanced.
Yeah, I recently saw an investigative report by Newsday out on Long Island that looked at people's experiences with dealing with real estate agents, and it was so interesting to see the results. And they set up a situation where a white person would go in and speak to a real estate agent, a person of color would go in and speak to an agent, and they would have the same background, same qualifications. And it was surprising to see the differences in the neighborhoods that were recommended, the values of the homes that were recommended, and even the barriers that were put in front of the people of color in terms of not even taking them out to see houses unless they provided additional documentation versus what was necessary for the white customers. So this is still happening today, and it definitely is creating a situation where not everyone has the same opportunities. So, given all of these aspects of the systemic issues, what are some of the things that people can do today to work to set themselves up for success and at the same time address the systemic issues and push things forward in a way that perhaps over the course of time these do begin to become eliminated?
Yeah, I think that when we're talking about systemic issues, we have to start with the system, right? And so I think one thing that people can do to set themselves up for success is finding ways to support a different system, a new system that doesn't continue to perpetuate disadvantages for Black people and people of color. And even as we've talked about banking, we've talked about real estate, we've talked about pretty much any area of life that is common to every single person, not just Black people or white people or anybody else. Everyone is looking, to purchase a house or to establish themselves with real estate that they can have a roof over their head and their family's head. Everyone wants to be able to not live paycheck to paycheck. And I think as we're talking about some of the things that have happened or that have been created, not have happened, because I feel like if I say happened, it was like, it's something that happened. Really things that were created to work in the detriment of Black people and people of color. I think that that's where we would have to start. And in thinking about like what, because I don't know if your question was more so what Black people can do to kind of get in a better footing, but in thinking about the Black community, if you're in a neighborhood or a community that is discriminated against by banks, right? So you have higher interest rates or no loans at all, and you see an increase in predatory lending, like Alanna had mentioned, when it comes to title loans and payday loans. I think something that we could do to help move the ball down the field is to destroy those companies. And I know that sounds very, I don't know, very violent or harsh, but I hate payday and title loans. And the only way that they are in business and stay in business is by like preying on the poor. So I'm not even talking about just Black people. I'm talking about everybody, right? Because although after he was murdered, Dr. King was someone who was talking about the economics of what the country has to do, not just for Black people or people of color, but what the country needs to do for people who are in a station of poverty, right? And until we start making systems and building systems that are helping people literally get up from out of poverty, then, you know, a lot of the other things that we're talking about or could talk about won't move the needle much. Like even as we're all in the financial literacy space, there's a point a couple of decades ago, and it may still be this way now, that Black percentage of savings was higher than any other community, right? But if the wealth is a tenth of what a white family would have it versus a Black family, saving the $100 or the $1,000 a month, and having such a disparity of earnings, and we talked about houses, so property value and assets, it's not going to move the needle, right? So I think that the big thing that we could and should do is to create systems that are benefiting Black people and people of color. And this isn't a gotcha or a I know I've heard some people talk about reverse racism, which is kind of wild to me. But I think that if I look at it from a lens of someone who just has, who's been fed textbook education from like a K through 12 educational system, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds on the educational system, because even that was created to make sure that people didn't build wealth in the communities that they were in. Then they may have this lens that, oh, well, if this Black person gets this benefit and I don't get this benefit, then that's racist, right? And that doesn't make sense in regards to historical means, because I think sometimes we just look at it from a lens and say, hey, I was born in 1987, like things have had to change, by now, as far as for the world, like we're integrating, we're doing all these different things, right? And when you look at the statistics, it's not so. And that's not because people aren't learning to manage their money or to save it or to invest it or to purchase a house or to build a business. It's largely in part of the systemic issues that we've been talking about. So I know that I'm not going to put I'm not going to put the pressure and onus on the Black community, because I think that there's a lot of work being done right now in terms of seeing things change, but it has to be a larger effort from the white community, really. And because in that regard, you can see things that are different. Like even Harlan, even you mentioned that in the past 2 months, like you're seeing things differently because of the things you're reading, the things you're listening to, the things that you are watching that are explaining things differently than you have learned them in the past. And so as you're getting this new information, what does it look like for you to champion an initiative or something like that for Black people or people of color, or to even educate more white people to say, hey, I know you think that may be reverse racism because this program specifically targets helping Black people build wealth, but let me just give you a little history lesson on how this thing has been going since 1619. So I think, to answer your question, there are a lot of things that we can do as citizens like of America, but I won't put the onus on the Black community to say like, oh, there's so many more things that we should do. We should save and we should budget, because that's not moving the needle, and it's not that people don't know to do these things. If you ask people in a community that may be lacking resources, because there's a large inequality in opportunities and resources for communities. If you ask people in communities that lack resources, hey, what would you do if you got this windfall? People are not going to say like, oh, I'll blow the money. Like, I would just blow it all. No, they want to try to set themselves up for the future the same way that you are, or the same way that I am, or the same way that Alanna is. And it's just a matter of having enough experiences to say, okay, well, this is what the future looks like for me now that things are changing. This is what the opportunity looks like now that things are changing.
So we saw recently that Netflix made a pretty big announcement that they were going to place a significant amount of assets into Black-owned banks. Is that a good example for what people can do to support POC and the Black community? Is that something that are there other ways for non-POC to invest and be aware of the systemic issues that are holding people back?
I think that's a great way to start, especially with Black banks. As Stephen mentioned earlier, there's not that many Black banks. There wasn't a Black bank in my community before I moved to New York, and there's a Black bank around the corner. But when you look at it, like, most people who bank at Black banks are Black or people of color. And so when you're putting money into that bank, that now allows that bank to be able to offer more mortgages, to be able to offer more loans to small businesses or to nonprofits. Whereas before, I think when you look at banks, sometimes, like, I'll even say for myself, like, when I looked at the bank around the corner, I was like, yeah, I'm gonna have to only put a savings over there, because they do not have the same funding. And so, like, their tech is not the same. Like, they really can't compete the same way or give us those conveniences that you get from your big brick and mortars. And so that helps start and push the needle as far as, being able to support our community. And I do think that what we will need is for more companies to contribute to the different causes, to the different foundations that support. Like, I don't remember the name right now, but there is a foundation or a nonprofit that helps with Black executives, as far as giving them the training that they actually need to be able to compete and to be able to manage these companies that actually does well. Because we'll hear about a company and all of a sudden that company may go under, and it's normally a funding issue. And so, like, this particular organization, they raise money to support those particular executives, but then they also try to put money back into the community. So we definitely need to find, like, organizations like that to contribute to, that help build up the community as far as giving the training that's needed to be able to be successful.
So here's a question. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll add to that. So I think that Alanna is correct in saying that putting I want to say it's $100 or $300 million in Black banks, like, it's cool. Shout out to Netflix for that. But I think to this point, it should be easy to see that we have integrated labor, but very segregated capital and assets. So when you're talking about banks in general, like, the biggest banks have been I mean, the whistle has been blown of the discrimination that Bank of America has done, that Wells Fargo has done, that Chase has done, like all of these different banks, right? And so you're thinking about not only the distrust that people have for banks, but also when you have, like Alanna mentioned, when you have a Black bank, it's usually being funded by Black people. So if you're thinking about all of the things that we've already talked about, redlining, which has also attributed to your house value being less than your white counterpart who may have the same experiences and education, your job, right? Getting paid 13% less. So we're talking about $100,000 job versus an $87,000 job, right? And then we're also talking about when you're putting this money into the bank, there aren't a lot of white dollars that are coming into the bank. They're going into bigger banks like the ones that I just mentioned. So you don't see the tech that Alanna is looking for as she moves her money from, a Wells Fargo to a like a Citizens Trust or a One United Bank or an Optus Bank, like here in Columbia, South Carolina. And so I think that it's a start, right? It's one thing that we can do. I think it's a lot of things like there are a lot of people who mentioned to me or mentioned to people that you have to vote. Like our ancestors died for the opportunity to vote. And I always push back on that. Even though I do vote, our ancestors died for equity and equality. And we thought that voting was that thing that was going to get us there. But to this point, we see that it's so many layers and factors that will actually contribute to the actual point of equity and equality. And so putting the money in a Black bank, yes, that's awesome. But how many Black businesses are you supporting? How many Black companies are funding like loans for a company? Or how many Black banks are being brought in or to the table for a $10 or $50 million development project in the city? How many Black construction companies are leading a project of that size? How many? And I could keep going because there's so many different factors. But the shout out to Netflix for that. I think that there's so many other things that we can do in the community, as entrepreneurs, as business owners, and then as professionals who know that we want to see things change in this regard.
I think we have a little bit of time for some questions from Facebook. Here's one. As a non-white, non-Black person of color, how can I stand with you and support change and awareness? What would you like me to do? I don't want to offend anyone, but I want to show up.
This is an awesome question. So I love this question from people who are who don't specifically align themselves with the Black community or say that they are in the Black community. So for our white counterparts, our people of color counterparts who don't identify as Black, this is a great question. But I think that one thing you can do is educate yourself on some of the things that we've been talking about, because I think as you hear news stories and different things that are coming out, you think like, dang, slavery was so long ago. But I just talked to my uncle last week and tracing my lineage back to 1870. I know that the parents of my great grandparents were probably enslaved, right? And so just thinking about, it wasn't that long ago. It really wasn't. And just getting more history about, one, how things have gotten here in 2020. And then two, another thing that you can do, like that's more active that you can do right now if you're not like into jumping into books or listening to podcasts, because I know that even having this conversation, it's a challenging one to have or a difficult one to have, because some people feel guilty that they haven't done, they don't feel like they've done enough at this point, or some people feel like, well, I don't think things are that way or this way. Another thing you can do is support Black business and getting your friends and community to support Black businesses. And that's restaurants. That is like Club Loofah, which is a company that sells loofahs, right? It's owned by a Black woman. That is using companies to, when you're contracting out for a service, that you're thinking of not just my homeboy who is next door to me, but um, a wider range of companies that can do the job to the T, dot the I's, curl the Q's, and everything that you're looking for, but you just haven't broadened your horizon or expanded like your view of, oh, well, maybe I should look for other companies that may not look like me or represent my specific community, because there are going to be new perspectives that I've never seen or thought of. So those are things that you can do now, like do research, educate your community on how they can help, and then also support Black businesses. Like vote on your intentions that you want to support with your dollars.
How do you find Black owned businesses that you might not be aware of, who might not be advertising to you specifically?
Well, it depends on what you're looking for, right? So if you're like, if you're looking for like a product, and usually a lot of people go to Amazon, like that's their first stop. My first stop is WeBuyBlack.com, because I know that the people who are on that platform are Black people who are selling products and services and the same things that I may be looking for. But another thing that you can do is just ask, like, because of the world and how Facebook is going, you can ask that question on Facebook, and I feel like someone from your community will drop some resources on you to find more places, because there are so many apps out there now that are specifically helping Black businesses get more exposure because of the question that you're asking now. Like, well, how do I find a Black owned business that's not necessarily marketing that they are a Black owned business? So that's those are two ways that you can, find more Black owned businesses to support.
Yeah, and we just had a comment on Facebook from Jennifer saying that Yelp now allows businesses to self-identify as Black. So,
oh wow,
that is that's a great way. We're on Yelp all the time looking at business reviews, so it'll be good to see that. Yeah. So there was another question here from Jennifer, is also looking for examples of codifying systemic racism. I think what she's looking to find is how systemic racism has translated to unconscious or implicit bias in people, and possibly in their shopping decisions or their or really any decision. Oh, Stephen, you're on mute.
I was saying, I couldn't answer fast enough. I think that when it comes to Black businesses and like implicit bias against Black businesses, we can go back to what we were talking about before. The for people who, as I traced back my lineage, as I mentioned, for people who are like 2 generations removed, right, from enslaved people, then how much capital or assets have been given to start a business, to grow a business, to scale a business, right? So we could think about that. And I think that something that comes up often, or that I hear often, is that the service may not be up to par, or maybe it doesn't look the way that you want it to look. Well, how much can you put into a building or place if the dollars that you're using and getting are being used to fund the business that you're building, instead of these bells and whistles that people may be looking for or asking for? So I think if we're talking about like how, in terms of systemic issues, how those are played out in the world today, when people are looking for Black businesses and feeling like, because I know that there are some people in our community that aren't Black people that say, well, I would support them, but I just wish they had fill in the blank. And it's like, okay, well, great. How about you go support them so they can get that? So I think that implicit bias, like, it pours out of people, and not just white people or other people of color, but I think because of the education of what a Black business looks like and the lack of resources and assets to build a Black business, there are people in our community that, oftentimes feel the same way. But I think we're getting educated in general to say, you know what, if a business is scaling, it may not look like your local donut shop is not going to look like a Krispy Kreme, or your company that's just getting started with a new app is not going to be as functional as Facebook, where you can add Zoom plugins and all these different things that are popping off. So, really it goes back to voting on these businesses with your dollars. And I think when it comes to supporting business, we often support the entrepreneur, the business owner. And I think we should use that same mindset when it comes to supporting businesses that are checking the boxes of what we're looking for, right? If I'm looking for a restaurant to go to, well, maybe I'm looking for a restaurant to go to, and I'm going to specifically find a restaurant on this list that's Black owned. And when I walk in there, I'm not going to judge them for how much seating they have available, because this is the location that they were able to afford and start building their business. But implicit bias goes so far past just like supporting Black business. There have been a couple of studies that even I know that Sean Rochester has done like an extensive amount of work on this. He wrote a book called The Black Tax and talks about the conscious and unconscious bias that we have against the Black community, like as a whole. And it's not just saying like, oh, this business is not up to par, but even as you mentioned, Harlan, with the Newsday article that you saw, even when all things are equal, people are saying like, oh, I'm going to still discriminate against this Black person. We're talking about names on a resume. We're talking about errors on a test or a paper that the same exact error will not be circled or marked for a white person that it is for a Black person. And I think if you can even step back enough to say, well, this is actually happening right now in 2020, how am I participating in this? A simple question as that, and filling in the blank there, you will start to get to a point where you say, well, how can I change that? How can I do something different than continuing this process and system that I've been seeing and saying that this is wrong?
Great. With that, I think we're going to wrap it up for today. This has been a really great conversation. Alanna, would you like to just tell everyone how they might be able to find you and what you might be working on?
Yeah, so you can find me at financialdemics.com, and you can find me at financialdemics everywhere. Right now, I am building my YouTube channel, so you definitely can come over there and check me out. I'm talking about the basics of personal finance, and that's mostly because when I worked in investments, I realized that even though people had thousands of dollars, they have no idea of how to handle their personal money. So I try to help people with handling their personal money so they're not pulling money out of their investments when they get to that point.
Great. And Stephen, thank you as well. You want to let everyone know how they might find you?
Sure. You mentioned my organization earlier. It's No Money. It's spelled KNOW. And really, we focus on teaching college students how to think, talk, and interact with money positively so they can live carefree responsibly. But they can find us on social media at No Money Inc. That's KNOWMONEYINC. And then I'm across social media as No Money Steve. That's KNOWMONEYSTEVE. And our website is nomoney.org.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for joining me today. This has been a great conversation, and I really appreciate it. And
Yeah,
I was going to say thanks for inviting me. And also, I have to say this before we jump off is I know it may not be the easiest thing to get on Facebook and broadcast that you're now learning these new things. 1 or 2 months past as far as like what's going on in the community in general. But I appreciate you for not only hosting this, but organizing, you and your team organizing this conversation and doing the work that it takes to make some changes down the road.
Yeah, it's been enlightening the past couple of months, and we're all hoping that we can move things forward and make some changes for the better, and do what's best for as many people as possible. So thank you again so much, and stay tuned for another webinar next week.